My name is Whitney, and I'm 28 years old. 3 hours ago, I was lying on my kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, my left arm twisted at an unnatural angle, blood pooling beneath my head. But what shattered me more than my broken bones was hearing my mother-in-law's voice cutting through my screams like ice. She wasn't telling my husband to stop. She was telling him he wasn't hitting me hard enough. I used to believe that family meant safety, that home was where you found protection. I was wrong. Before I share what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if stories like this matter to you. Now let me take you back to how this nightmare began. 3 years ago, my life felt like a fairy tale waiting to unfold. I met Marcus on a rainy Tuesday morning at a small coffee shop in downtown Portland. I was running late for work, fumbling with my umbrella, when this tall, dark-haired man in a navy suit stepped forward to hold the door. His smile was warm, genuine, the kind that reaches your eyes. When he asked if he could buy me a coffee to make up for the terrible weather, I said yes without hesitation. Marcus was 31, a software engineer with gentle hands and a laugh that made my chest feel light. He had this way of listening when I talked, really listening, like every word I said mattered. During our first month of dating, he remembered that I preferred vanilla lattes over caramel, that I got nervous before big presentations at the advertising firm where I worked, and that I'd lost both my parents in a car accident 2 years earlier. He seemed almost too good to be true. Marcus would show up at my apartment with Thai takeout when I'd had a rough day. He'd leave little notes in my purse, sweet things like, "Hope your meeting goes well," or "Can't wait to see you tonight." When I mentioned loving art galleries, he surprised me with tickets to a contemporary exhibition downtown. We spent hours walking through the displays, his arm around my waist, talking about color and meaning and dreams. 6 months into our relationship, Marcus introduced me to his mother. Helen Patterson was 58 years old, a retired nurse who lived in a pristine Victorian house in the suburbs. Everything about her seemed perfectly controlled, from her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun to her pearl earrings and pressed slacks. But her eyes were different, cold, like blue ice that never melted. The dinner was formal, more formal than I'd expected from meeting my boyfriend's mother. Helen had set the dining room table with china and crystal real silverware that caught the light from an ornate chandelier. Marcus seemed different in that house, quieter, more careful with his words. When Helen asked about my family background, her questions felt more like an interrogation than polite curiosity. "So your parents are deceased," she said, cutting her roast beef with surgical precision. "No siblings either. How unfortunate. Family is so important. Don't you think Marcus has always been very close to family?" Her tone suggested that my lack of relatives was somehow a character flaw, something I should apologize for. Throughout the evening, Helen made subtle comparisons to other women Marcus had dated. Rebecca was such a lovely girl. She came from a wonderful family in Seattle, had her master's degree in literature. Or, Vanessa knew how to cook traditional meals. She understood the importance of maintaining family recipes. Each comment felt like a small cut, precise and intentional. When we left that night, I felt drained and somehow smaller. Marcus noticed my quiet mood and pulled me close in the car. "She likes you," he said, kissing my temple. "Mom just needs time to warm up. She's protective of me because Dad died when I was young. She's all I have." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to be the understanding girlfriend who would eventually win over the skeptical mother. When Marcus proposed 8 months later, right there in the same coffee shop where we'd met, I cried with happiness. He'd remembered every detail that mattered to me. The ring was simple and elegant, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. Helen's reaction to our engagement was enthusiastic in words, but somehow hollow in feeling. "How wonderful," she said, embracing me with arms that felt stiff and rehearsed. "We'll need to start planning immediately. A Patterson wedding must be done properly according to family tradition." That phrase, family tradition, would soon become the soundtrack to my disappearing independence. The first cracks in my fairy tale appeared during wedding planning. What I'd imagined would be a joyful time of choosing flowers and tasting cake became a series of battles where I somehow always lost. Helen had opinions about everything, and Marcus always deferred to her expertise. I dreamed of an outdoor ceremony in the Rose Garden at Laurelhurst Park, somewhere intimate and natural with the people I loved. Helen immediately dismissed the idea. Outdoor weddings are unpredictable and inappropriate for a family of our standing. We'll use the church where Marcus was baptized, where his father and I were married. It's only proper. When I tried to discuss it privately with Marcus, he sighed, like I was being unreasonable. Mom has experience with weddings, honey. She knows what works and what doesn't. Trust her judgment. But it wasn't her judgment I questioned. It was whether my own preferences mattered at all. The pattern continued with every decision. I wanted wildflowers in mason jars for centerpieces. Helen insisted on formal arrangements with white roses and baby's breath. I hoped for a small guest list of close friends and the few relatives I still spoke with. Helen produced a list of 200 people, mostly Marcus's extended family and her social circle. When I pointed out that my side would have maybe 20 people, she waved dismissively. Quality over quantity, dear. Besides, you're joining our family now. Our friends will become your friends. The wedding dress shopping trip crystallized my growing unease. I'd been looking forward to this tradition, imagining trying on different styles while my future mother-in-law offered gentle guidance. Instead, Helen arrived at the bridal shop with 3 specific dresses already selected. They were all conservative, high-necked, long-sleeved gowns that would have been appropriate for a Victorian funeral. These reflect the dignity of our family, Helen explained to the sales associate, as if I weren't standing right there. We prefer classic elegance to trendy styles. When I tried to suggest looking at other options, Helen's smile became sharp. Marcus specifically mentioned that he likes modest styles. Surely you want to please your future husband. The sales associate looked between us, uncomfortably clearly sensing the tension, but unsure how to intervene. I ended up in a dress that made me feel like I was wearing a costume playing the role of the bride Helen wanted me to be, rather than expressing who I actually was. Standing in front of the 3-way mirror, I barely recognized myself. The woman looking back at me seemed pale, diminished, like a shadow of the person who'd walked into that shop. The night before our wedding, Marcus came home from his bachelor party drunk and agitated. I'd been expecting him to be happy, maybe a little nervous, but instead he seemed angry about something I couldn't identify. When I asked if everything was okay, he exploded. Everything is not okay, Whitney. Do you have any idea how stressful this has been? Mom's been planning this wedding for months while you've done nothing but complain about every decision. She's trying to help you, and you act like she's the enemy. I stood there in our shared apartment wearing the pajamas I'd bought specially for our last night as an unmarried couple, feeling like I'd been slapped. Marcus, I just wanted some input on my own wedding. I wanted it to feel like us. Us. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. There is no us without family, Whitney. That's something you wouldn't understand having no family of your own. But Mom and I were a package deal. The sooner you accept that, the better off we'll all be. He went to bed without another word, leaving me sitting on the couch, wondering if I should call off the wedding. But where would I go? My friends lived scattered across different states, busy with their own lives. My small savings account wouldn't cover deposits on a new apartment and breaking our lease. Most importantly, I loved Marcus. I believed that once the stress of the wedding was over, we'd go back to being the couple who laughed together over coffee and planned adventures for our future. Our wedding day dawned gray and drizzly, which Helen declared was good luck despite having insisted we couldn't have an outdoor ceremony because of weather concerns. As I sat in the bridal preparation room, having my makeup applied by a woman Helen had hired, I realized I felt more like an actor preparing for a performance than a bride getting ready for her wedding. Helen supervised every detail of my preparation, from the shade of lipstick to the way my hair was styled. When my maid of honor, Sarah, tried to suggest a slight change to make me more comfortable, Helen shut her down quickly. Everything has been planned perfectly. We don't need last-minute modifications. Walking down that church aisle, I saw Marcus waiting at the altar, looking handsome in his black tuxedo. For a moment, my heart lifted. This was the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who brought me soup when I was sick, and who made me laugh until my sides ached. But as I got closer, I noticed Helen in the front row nodding approvingly at each step I took, and I realized I felt more like I was being delivered to her than choosing to marry her son. The ceremony proceeded exactly as Helen had orchestrated. The reception featured her chosen menu, her selected band, her approved decorations. I smiled and greeted guests, most of whom I'd never met before. When people asked about my family, I gave the practiced explanation about my parents' death and my small extended family. Their sympathetic responses made me feel even more alone in my wedding dress. During our first dance, Marcus whispered in my ear, "You look beautiful, Mrs. Patterson." But even that intimate moment felt performed like we were playing roles in Helen's vision of what a perfect wedding couple should be. Our honeymoon in Napa Valley should have been a chance to reconnect, to remember why we'd chosen each other. Instead, Marcus spent an hour each evening on the phone with his mother, updating her on our activities and asking for recommendations about restaurants and wineries. When I suggested we might skip one of these calls to have a romantic dinner, he looked at me like I'd suggested something unreasonable. Mom put a lot of effort into researching this trip for us. The least we can do is let her know we're following her suggestions. Even on our honeymoon, Helen was the third person in our relationship. After our honeymoon, we moved into a house Marcus had chosen, conveniently located just 2 blocks from Helen's Victorian home. I hadn't been included in the house hunting process. Marcus and Helen had found and purchased it while I was busy with wedding preparations. "We wanted to surprise you," Marcus explained, but it felt less like a gift and more like a decision that had been made about my life without consulting me. The house was beautiful, I had to admit. A charming craftsman-style bungalow with original hardwood floors and built-in bookcases. But from the first day, it never felt like mine. Helen had a spare key naturally, since she'd helped with the house hunting. What I didn't expect was how freely she'd use it. I'd come home from work at the advertising agency to find Helen in my kitchen, reorganizing my cabinets or preparing dinner for Marcus. "I thought I'd help you get settled," she'd say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A working wife has so many responsibilities. I want to make sure Marcus is properly cared for." The reorganization of my kitchen was just the beginning. Helen moved my coffee mugs to a higher shelf and put her preferred china in the easy-to-reach cabinets. She rearranged my spice rack according to her system and replaced my colorful dish towels with plain white ones that she deemed more appropriate. When I tried to change things back, she'd return the next day and quietly restore her preferred arrangement. Marcus not only allowed this invasion, but encouraged it. When I tried to talk to him about boundaries, he acted like I was being ungrateful. "Mom's trying to help you learn how to run a household properly. She's been doing this for 30 years. Maybe you should listen to her advice instead of fighting it." The cooking lessons were particularly humiliating. Helen would arrive unannounced while I was preparing dinner and immediately take over, critiquing everything from how I chopped vegetables to the spices I selected. "Marcus has very particular tastes," she'd explain, pushing me aside to demonstrate the correct technique. "He's used to meals prepared a certain way." No matter how hard I tried to replicate Helen's recipes, Marcus always found something to criticize. The sauce was too thin, the meat was overcooked, the seasoning wasn't quite right. "It's not as good as when Mom makes it," became his standard response to my efforts. I began to dread dinner time, knowing that my cooking would be found lacking compared to Helen's perfect standards. The pressure about having children started almost immediately after we returned from our honeymoon. Helen would make pointed comments about empty bedrooms that needed to be filled and how Marcus needed an heir to carry on the Patterson family name. When I mentioned wanting to wait until we were more financially stable, both Helen and Marcus reacted with disapproval. "Children don't wait for perfect timing," Helen declared. "They're a blessing whenever they arrive. Besides, Marcus has excellent job security, and I can help with childcare. There's no reason to delay starting your family. Marcus began pressuring me to stop taking birth control, suggesting that we should let nature take its course. When I insisted on waiting, he accused me of being selfish and materialistic. Other women would be grateful for a husband who wants children with them. Maybe you're not as ready for marriage as you claim to be. The physical aggression started small and escalated gradually. The first time Marcus pushed me, we were arguing about my desire to visit Sarah in Seattle for her birthday. I'd already bought plane tickets and requested time off work when Marcus announced that Helen had planned a family dinner that same weekend. "You can see Sarah any time," Marcus said, dismissing my plans like they were meaningless. "Family dinners only happen once a month. Mom specifically requested that you be there to meet my cousin's new wife." When I protested that I'd already made commitments, Marcus grabbed my shoulders and shoved me backward. I stumbled against the kitchen counter, catching myself before I fell. The physical contact lasted only seconds, but the shock lasted much longer. "I'm sorry," Marcus said immediately, looking startled by his own actions. "I didn't mean to do that. I'm just stressed about disappointing Mom. You know how important family is to her." I should have recognized that moment as a turning point, a clear signal that our relationship was becoming dangerous. Instead, I focused on his apology and his explanation. I told myself that the stress of early marriage had made him react poorly, that it wouldn't happen again if I was more understanding about his family obligations. Helen's response when she learned I'd canceled my Seattle trip was triumphant rather than sympathetic. "I'm so glad Marcus helped you see reason," she said, patting my hand with false warmth. "Wives need to prioritize family commitments over friendships. Marriage requires sacrifices." I began to understand that Helen saw our marriage not as Marcus gaining a partner, but as her gaining another person to control. Every decision had to be approved by her, every plan had to consider her preferences, every aspect of my life had to align with her vision of how a Patterson wife should behave. Marcus's criticism of my appearance increased as Helen's influence grew stronger. She would make comments about my clothing being too casual or my hair needing more structure. Within days, Marcus would echo similar sentiments, suggesting I dress more conservatively or style myself more formally. When I resisted, he became irritated and accusatory. "You're not the same person I married," he'd say. "You used to care about making a good impression. Now you seem to want to embarrass me in front of my family." The isolation from my friends happened gradually. First, Marcus would schedule family events that conflicted with my social plans. Then he'd criticize my friends as being immature or inappropriate influences. When I tried to maintain these relationships despite his disapproval, he'd become sullen and punitive, making my life at home miserable until I canceled my plans to keep peace. Helen supported every restriction Marcus placed on my social life. "A married woman's primary relationships should be with her husband and his family," she'd say approvingly. "Outside friendships can create divided loyalties and unhealthy influences." 8 months after our wedding, the violence escalated from pushing to hitting. The incident that broke that barrier started with something completely trivial. I'd made a comment about the weather while Marcus was watching television, and he snapped at me for interrupting his show. When I pointed out that weather comments hardly constituted an interruption, he stood up and slapped me across the face. The sound echoed in our living room like a gunshot. I stood there with my hand pressed to my stinging cheek, unable to process what had just happened. This was Marcus, the man who used to kiss my forehead goodnight, who brought me flowers for no reason, who had promised to love and protect me until death do us part. "Look what you made me do," he said, but his voice sounded strange, like he was surprised by his own actions. "I don't like being disrespected in my own home, Whitney. You need to learn when to keep quiet." I ran to our bedroom and locked the door, crying until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. Part of me wanted to pack a bag and leave immediately. But where would I go? I had no family, and my friendships had withered under Marcus's constant criticism and scheduling conflicts. My job paid enough for me to live independently, but barely, and the idea of starting over completely felt overwhelming. 20 minutes later, Helen's key turned in our front door lock. She must have seen Marcus's car in the driveway and decided to make one of her unannounced visits. I heard their voices in the living room. Marcus's tone defensive, and Helen's surprisingly calm. After several minutes, Helen knocked on the bedroom door. "Whitney, dear, open the door. We need to have a conversation." I opened the door reluctantly, my face still red and tear-stained. Helen looked at me with what might have been sympathy if I hadn't known her better. Marcus stood behind her, looking like a child who'd been caught misbehaving. "Marriage is an adjustment for everyone," Helen said in her practiced nurse's voice. "Sometimes tensions run high, and people react in ways they normally wouldn't. The important thing is learning from these moments and moving forward together." I stared at her in disbelief. "He hit me, Helen. That's not a marital adjustment. That's assault." "Don't be dramatic, dear. Marcus barely touched you and he's already apologized. Marriages require forgiveness and understanding. You'll need to develop thicker skin if you want this relationship to work." She made it sound like I was the problem, like my reaction to being hit was more concerning than the hitting itself. Marcus nodded along with her words, his earlier remorse already replaced by righteous indignation. "Exactly. Mom understands what marriage really involves. Maybe if you listened to her more often instead of always fighting against our family traditions, we wouldn't have these conflicts." Helen stayed for dinner that night, cooking Marcus's favorite meal, while I sat at the kitchen table feeling like a stranger in my own home. She served him like he was a king returning from battle, asking about his day at work and praising his recent promotion. I might as well have been invisible for all the attention either of them paid to me. Before she left, Helen pulled me aside for what she called a heart-to-heart conversation. "Marcus is a good man from a good family," she said, her voice taking on a steely edge despite her gentle words. "He works hard to provide for you, and he deserves respect and support at home. If you can't give him that, perhaps you're not ready for the responsibilities of marriage." The message was clear: if I didn't accept Marcus's treatment without complaint, I'd be the one at fault when our marriage failed. Helen was positioning herself not as a neutral party, trying to help us work through problems, but as Marcus's ally in reshaping me into the wife she thought he deserved. 2 weeks later, Marcus came home drunk from a work happy hour and found me reading on the couch instead of having his dinner ready. He'd never called to say he'd be late, but apparently I should have anticipated his needs anyway. This time he didn't just slap me, he punched me in the stomach hard enough to double me over. As I gasped for breath on the floor, Marcus stood over me ranting about disrespectful wives and women who didn't understand their place. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional devastation was worse. This wasn't the man I'd married. This wasn't even human behavior. This was something monstrous wearing Marcus's face. I managed to crawl to the bathroom and lock the door, then used my cell phone to call 911. But before I could speak to the dispatcher, Marcus was pounding on the door, demanding that I come out and face him like an adult. In my panic and pain, I hung up the phone, terrified that involving the police would only make him angrier. Helen arrived within minutes, as if she'd been waiting for this call. I heard her voice in the hallway, calm and controlled, talking Marcus down from his rage. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, she was sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking like she was visiting on a social call. "Come sit down, Whitney. Let's discuss what happened here tonight." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What happened is that your son assaulted me. I'm calling the police, and then I'm leaving." Helen's expression didn't change, but her voice became arctic. "You're not calling anyone, and you're not going anywhere. You made a commitment when you married Marcus and Patterson. Women don't run away from their responsibilities at the first sign of difficulty." Difficulty? I was shaking with rage and adrenaline. He punched me in the stomach. This isn't difficulty. It's domestic violence. "It's marriage," Helen said firmly. "Real marriage, not the fantasy version you apparently expected. Men have needs and pressures that women don't always understand. Sometimes they react strongly when those needs aren't met. A good wife learns to anticipate and avoid those situations. She was blaming me for Marcus's violence, suggesting that I'd somehow caused him to lose control by failing to meet his unspoken expectations. The worst part was watching Marcus nod along with her explanation, his earlier remorse completely replaced by self-righteous justification. The months that followed established a horrifying pattern. Marcus would assault me over increasingly trivial provocations, and Helen would arrive afterward to provide emotional support to him while lecturing me about wifely duties and family loyalty. I began to understand that Helen wasn't just enabling Marcus's violence. She was actively encouraging it as a method of controlling me. My attempts to reach out for help were systematically blocked. When I tried to call Sarah from work, Marcus somehow found out and accused me of gossiping about our private business. When I researched domestic violence resources online, he discovered my browser history and flew into a rage about my disloyalty to our family. Eventually, he confiscated my laptop and monitored my cell phone usage, claiming that married couples shouldn't have secrets from each other. Helen supported every restriction, framing Marcus's controlling behavior as appropriate husbandly concern. A protective husband naturally wants to know who his wife is talking to and what she's doing, Helen would say when I protested his surveillance. Only women with something to hide object to that kind of caring attention. The violence escalated in both frequency and severity. Marcus began using objects to hit me, claiming that his hands hurt too much from work to use them for discipline. He favored a wooden spatula that Helen had given us as a wedding gift, saying it was fitting that her present should help teach me proper behavior. Helen's presence during and after these attacks became routine. She would sit in our living room afterward, calmly discussing my failures as a wife while I cleaned blood from various surfaces or tried to tend to my injuries. Her medical background made her particularly effective at assessing damage and determining whether hospital treatment would be necessary. "You're fortunate that Marcus has such good control," she'd tell me while examining a particularly bad bruise. "He could hurt you much worse if he wanted to. You should be grateful that he's showing such restraint." I lived in constant fear, walking on eggshells, and trying to anticipate Marcus's mood changes before they exploded into violence. I stopped expressing opinions, stopped making plans, stopped existing as anything other than a target for their shared cruelty. The woman who had once managed advertising campaigns and maintained an active social life disappeared, completely replaced by a frightened shadow who lived only to avoid the next beating. My coworkers began to notice changes in my behavior and appearance. I wore long sleeves and high necklines to cover bruises, but I couldn't hide the fear in my eyes or the way I flinched when people approached me suddenly. When my supervisor asked if everything was okay at home, I gave rehearsed answers about adjusting to married life and being busy with family obligations. Marcus had coached me on these responses, role-playing potential conversations, and correcting me when my answers didn't sound convincing enough. "If anyone asks about your bruises, you tell them you're clumsy and accident-prone," he'd instruct. "If they push for details, you get upset and change the subject. Make them feel guilty for prying into your personal business." Helen reinforced these lessons during her daily visits, reminding me that family business stayed within the family and that outsiders wouldn't understand the dynamics of a strong marriage. "People will try to interfere," she warned. "They'll claim to be helping, but they're really just looking for gossip and drama. A loyal wife protects her husband's reputation no matter what." The isolation became complete when Marcus convinced me to quit my job, claiming that his recent promotion meant I no longer needed to work outside the home. "I want to take care of you," he said, presenting this decision as romantic rather than controlling. "Mom never had to work once she married Dad. That's how real men treat their wives. Without my job, I lost my last connection to the outside world and my only source of independent income. I was completely dependent on Marcus for money, transportation, and contact with other human beings." Helen celebrated this development as a sign that our marriage was finally becoming properly traditional. "Now you can focus on what really matters," she said approvingly, "taking care of your husband and preparing for the children you'll hopefully have soon." The pressure to get pregnant intensified once I was unemployed. Both Helen and Marcus presented pregnancy as the natural next step, the thing that would complete our family and give me the purpose I was supposedly lacking. When I continued to resist, their disappointment turned to suspicion and anger. Most women would be thrilled to have a baby with a man like Marcus, Helen would say, making my reluctance sound pathological. Perhaps you're not as committed to this marriage as you claim to be. Marcus began sabotaging my birth control, poking holes in condoms and replacing my pills with placebos. When I discovered his tampering and confronted him, he didn't deny it. Instead, he became enraged that I'd been trying to prevent pregnancy without his knowledge. "You've been lying to me for months," he shouted, grabbing my wrists hard enough to leave marks. "Pretending to want children while secretly making sure it couldn't happen. What kind of wife deceives her husband about something that important?" Helen's response was even more chilling. "Deception about fertility is grounds for annulment in some states," she said calmly. "Marcus married you expecting children. If you're not willing to fulfill that expectation, perhaps this marriage was entered into under false pretenses. They were threatening to end our marriage unless I agreed to get pregnant immediately, but they were also making it clear that leaving Marcus wouldn't be simple or safe." Helen had been collecting information about my behavior, my statements, and my supposed failures as a wife. She spoke about having documentation that would make me look unstable or unfit in any legal proceedings. The night of March 15th began like many others, with Marcus drinking heavily after work and looking for reasons to be angry with me. I'd learned to make myself small and quiet during these moods, but sometimes that wasn't enough to prevent an explosion. That night, nothing I did could satisfy him. Marcus stumbled through our front door at 1:30 in the morning, his tie loose and his shirt wrinkled from whatever bar he'd been visiting after work. I'd been asleep for 2 hours, but the sound of him banging into furniture woke me immediately. Years of living with his violence had trained me to sleep lightly, always alert for signs of incoming danger. He appeared in our bedroom doorway, swaying slightly, his eyes unfocused but somehow still menacing. The smell of whiskey and cigarettes rolled off him in waves, mixing with his anger to create an atmosphere that made my skin crawl with dread. "Why weren't you waiting up for me?" he demanded, his words slurred but his tone sharp with accusation. "A real wife waits for her husband to come home no matter how late he is. Mom always waited up for Dad." I sat up carefully in bed, trying to keep my voice calm and non-threatening. "I waited until 12:30, Marcus. I fell asleep on the couch and only came to bed when you hadn't come home yet." The explanation that might have satisfied him on another night only fueled his rage that night. He lunged forward and grabbed my arm, yanking me out of bed with such force that I stumbled and nearly fell. "Don't lie to me," he screamed, his face inches from mine. "I saw the bedroom light was off when I drove up. You went to bed without giving a damn whether I made it home safe or not." Nothing I could say would have been right in that moment. If I'd been waiting up, he would have accused me of checking up on him or not trusting him. Since I'd gone to bed, I was neglectful and uncaring. The rules changed constantly, but the punishment stayed the same. Marcus backhanded me across the face, the impact sharp and sudden. My head snapped to the side, and I tasted blood where my teeth cut the inside of my cheek. Before I could recover, he grabbed a metal coat hanger from our closet, one of the heavy ones Helen had insisted we use to properly maintain Marcus's work clothes. "Mom told me what she thinks about wives who don't take care of their husbands," he said, raising the hanger like a weapon. "She said some women need stronger correction than others." The first blow caught me across the shoulders, the metal edge cutting through my thin pajama top and into my skin. I screamed and tried to protect myself with my arms, but Marcus was beyond reasoning or restraint. He hit me again across my back, then across my ribs. I fell to the floor, curling into a ball and begging him to stop. The pain was unlike anything I'd experienced before, sharp and burning and relentless. But Marcus kept hitting me, and with each blow he repeated something Helen had apparently told him about proper discipline and wifely obedience. "She said you need to learn respect," he panted between strikes. "She said you've been getting too comfortable, too defiant. She said a good husband doesn't let his wife get away with disrespect. When he finally paused, I thought the worst might be over. I was bleeding from several cuts, my pajamas torn and stained red, my body screaming with pain. But then I heard Helen's voice in our hallway, and I realized the nightmare was just beginning. "Marcus," I heard shouting, "is everything all right?" She had her own key, of course. She'd probably been listening for signs of conflict, waiting for an opportunity to involve herself in our domestic drama. But instead of being appalled by the scene she discovered, Helen surveyed the damage with cold satisfaction. "Good," she said, looking at me cowering on the floor. "She needed this. I was worried you were being too gentle with her." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, who had trained as a nurse and sworn to do no harm, was praising her son for beating his wife. She wasn't here to stop the violence. She was here to encourage it. "Please," I whispered, looking up at Helen with desperate hope that some maternal instinct might override her cruelty. "Please help me. I think my arm might be broken." Helen crouched down beside me, and for a moment I thought she might show mercy. Instead, she grabbed my injured arm and twisted it, sending lightning bolts of agony through my entire body. "It's not broken yet," she said clinically. "Marcus, you need to hit harder if you want to make a real impression." She's still talking back, still making demands. Clearly the message isn't getting through. Marcus looked uncertain for the first time since the beating began. "Mom, maybe that's enough for tonight. She's bleeding pretty badly." Helen stood up and faced her son, her expression disappointed and stern. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us to this point, Marcus. You've been too soft, too willing to accept half measures. Look at her behavior over the past few months. Has anything really changed? Has she become the wife you deserve?" She was coaching him, teaching him to be more effective at hurting me. I watched in horror as Marcus's face hardened again, his brief moment of doubt replaced by renewed determination. "You're right, Mom. I have been too easy on her." Helen smiled and nodded approvingly. "A Patterson man doesn't accept disrespect from anyone, especially not his own wife. Your father would be ashamed to see how she treats you." Marcus picked up the coat hanger again, and this time his strikes were more calculated, more vicious. When he hit my left arm, I heard the bones snap with a sound like a branch breaking. The pain was so intense that my vision went white, and I think I might have briefly lost consciousness. When awareness returned, I was lying in a pool of my own blood, my arm bent at an impossible angle while Helen and Marcus stood over me discussing their next steps like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a human being who needed medical attention. "We should move her to the bathroom," Helen was saying. "The tile will be easier to clean than this carpet." "What if she dies?" Marcus asked, and I could hear real worry in his voice for the first time that night. "She won't die from this," Helen replied matter-of-factly. "I've seen much worse injuries in my nursing days, but she'll remember this lesson for a long time." As they debated whether to drag me across the house, I heard something that gave me hope for the first time in hours. Our doorbell was ringing sharp and insistent, cutting through their conversation like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. The doorbell rang again, followed by loud knocking and a voice I recognized. Mrs. Murphy, our 72-year-old neighbor, was shouting through our front door with surprising volume and determination. "I know someone's hurt in there. I've called the police and they're on their way. You better open this door right now." Marcus and Helen exchanged panicked glances. Mrs. Murphy lived alone in the house next to ours, and I'd always thought she was just a harmless elderly lady who kept to herself. I'd never imagined she would be the one to save my life. "Ignore her," Helen whispered urgently. "She'll give up and go away if we don't respond." But Mrs. Murphy wasn't giving up. The knocking became more insistent, and her voice grew louder. "I heard that poor girl screaming for 20 minutes. I'm not leaving until I know she's safe." Marcus tried to put on his normal voice, the charming tone he used when he wanted to manipulate people. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Murphy. Just a small domestic disagreement. Nothing to worry about." "Don't you lie to me, young man." Mrs. Murphy's voice crackled with authority. I raised 5 sons and 2 daughters. I know the difference between an argument and someone being hurt. The police will be here in 5 minutes, so you might as well open this door." I could see the fear in Marcus's eyes as he realized his violence had finally attracted outside attention. Helen was frantically whispering instructions about what to say and how to explain my injuries, but for once, she seemed to be losing control of the situation. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I managed to scream as loudly as possible. "Help me! Please help me! They're going to kill me!" My voice was raw and broken, but it carried enough desperation to cut through Mrs. Murphy's front door and into the street beyond. I heard her gasp, then the sound of her feet hurrying away, probably to watch for the police from her own yard. Marcus grabbed my throat, trying to silence me, but it was too late. Mrs. Murphy had heard enough to know that this was serious, and she'd already committed to getting help. Within minutes, I could hear sirens approaching our street. Helen was now in full panic mode, trying to think of ways to explain the scene that paramedics and police were about to discover. "We'll say she fell down the stairs," she said rapidly, "or that she attacked you first and you were defending yourself." But when the paramedics burst through our front door, followed by 2 police officers, there was no explanation that could make sense of what they found. I was lying on our bedroom floor in a pool of blood, my arm obviously broken cuts and bruises covering my body, while Marcus stood over me holding a bloody coat hanger, and Helen knelt beside him looking guilty and desperate. Officer Davis, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, immediately took control of the scene. While the paramedics worked on stabilizing me for transport, she separated Marcus and Helen for individual questioning. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" one of the paramedics asked gently as they carefully examined my injuries. "Whitney Patterson," I managed to whisper. "Please don't let them hurt me anymore." "Nobody's going to hurt you now," he promised, and for the first time in months, I believed someone who said they would protect me. "We're going to take good care of you." As they loaded me onto a stretcher, I saw Marcus in handcuffs, finally facing consequences for his actions. Helen was arguing with the other police officer, claiming that this was all a misunderstanding and that I was mentally unstable. But the evidence was too clear, the injuries too severe for her lies to work anymore. The ambulance ride to the hospital passed in a blur of pain medication and concerned voices. The paramedic riding with me kept asking questions about my injuries, documenting each bruise and cut for the police report that would eventually put Marcus behind bars. At the hospital, Dr. Johnson, the emergency room physician, took photographs of my injuries for evidence while explaining each procedure he was performing. My left arm was indeed broken, requiring surgery to set the bone properly. I had 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, and numerous cuts that needed stitches. "Have you been experiencing domestic violence for a long time?" Dr. Johnson asked gently as he worked on my injuries. For the first time in months, I told the complete truth. I told him about the escalating abuse, about Helen's role in encouraging and directing the violence, about my isolation and fear, and the gradual destruction of my sense of self-worth. Johnson listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions that helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't normal marriage difficulties, but systematic abuse designed to control and destroy me. When I finished my account, he squeezed my uninjured hand gently. "You're very brave for telling me all of this," he said. "And you're going to be okay now. We're going to make sure you're safe." Officer Davis returned while I was still being treated, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of grim determination. She explained that Marcus had been arrested and charged with domestic violence and aggravated assault, while Helen faced charges for aiding and abetting domestic violence. "I need to ask you some difficult questions," Officer Davis said. "Are you willing to testify against both of them if this goes to trial?" The old Whitney, the scared and isolated woman who had lived in fear for so long, might have hesitated. But lying on that hospital bed, surrounded by people who were treating me with kindness and respect, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: courage. "Yes," I said firmly. "I want them both to pay for what they've done." The legal process moved more quickly than I'd expected, partly because the evidence was so overwhelming and partly because this wasn't Marcus's first offense. During the investigation, police discovered that he'd been arrested for domestic violence 3 years earlier before we'd met. The charges had been dropped when his then-girlfriend suddenly recanted her testimony and left the state, but the arrest report was still on file. Sarah flew in from Seattle the day after my hospitalization, taking emergency leave from her job to be with me during the initial medical treatment and legal proceedings. Seeing her familiar face in that hospital room made me cry harder than I had since the whole nightmare began. But for the first time in months, they were tears of relief rather than despair. "I'm so sorry I didn't know," she said, holding my uninjured hand while tears streamed down her face. "I should have realized something was wrong when you stopped returning my calls and canceled all our plans." I explained how Marcus and Helen had systematically isolated me from everyone who might have helped, how they'd made me feel like my friends wouldn't understand or care about my situation. Sarah listened with growing anger, occasionally muttering things about what she'd like to do to both of them if she ever got the chance. Through Sarah's research, I found Maria Rodriguez, an attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases. Maria had 15 years of experience prosecuting abusers and had an impressive track record of winning convictions even in difficult circumstances. When she reviewed the photographs of my injuries and read Dr. Johnson's report, her expression became grimly satisfied. "This is one of the clearest cases of domestic violence I've seen in years," she said during our first meeting. "The physical evidence is overwhelming. You have medical documentation, police reports, and witness testimony from your neighbor. But what makes this case unusual is the mother-in-law's involvement." Maria explained that while family members sometimes enable domestic violence through silence or denial, it was rare to find someone who actively participated in planning and encouraging the abuse. Helen's behavior that night, witnessed by police officers and documented in their reports, made her legally culpable as an accessory to assault. "She's not just a passive bystander," Maria continued. "According to your testimony and the police report, she was actively directing your husband's violence, coaching him to hurt you more effectively. That makes her equally responsible for your injuries." The discovery phase of the legal process revealed even more disturbing information about Helen's role in Marcus's previous relationship. Police tracked down Rebecca, the girlfriend, who dropped charges 3 years earlier, and convinced her to provide testimony about her own experiences. Rebecca's story was chillingly similar to mine. She described how Helen had gradually turned Marcus against her, how the violence had escalated over time, and how Helen had been present during at least 2 of the worst attacks. When Rebecca had tried to leave, Helen had threatened her with legal action and had used her connections in the medical community to damage Rebecca's reputation at the hospital where she worked as a technician. She told me that nobody would believe a word I said against her family. Rebecca testified during a pre-trial deposition. She said the Patterson name meant something in this city, and that I was nobody from nowhere trying to destroy a good man's reputation. The intimidation had worked on Rebecca, who'd been young and scared and financially vulnerable. But it wasn't going to work on me. With Sarah's support, Maria's legal expertise, and the clear evidence of what Marcus and Helen had done, I felt strong enough to face them in court. Marcus's defense attorney tried to argue that I'd been the aggressor that night, claiming that Marcus had only hit me after I attacked him first. But the physical evidence made this defense impossible to maintain. The coat hanger he'd used was covered with my blood, my injuries were consistent with being beaten rather than fighting back, and the police had found me cowering on the floor while Marcus stood over me with the weapon. Helen's defense was even more desperate. Her lawyer argued that she'd only been trying to help resolve a marital dispute, that her nursing background had led her to assess my injuries rather than participate in causing them. But the testimony from the responding officers contradicted this completely. They'd clearly heard Helen coaching Marcus to hit me harder, telling him that his previous efforts hadn't been effective enough. The trial lasted 3 days. I testified on the second day, describing in detail the 18 months of escalating abuse, the systematic isolation, and the night of March 15th when I'd nearly been killed. Looking directly at Marcus and Helen while I spoke felt like reclaiming a power they'd stolen from me, proving to myself that I was no longer afraid of their reactions to my words. Marcus was sentenced to 5 years in prison for aggravated domestic violence. The judge noted that the premeditated nature of the attack, the severity of my injuries, and his previous arrest record warranted the maximum sentence allowed under state guidelines. Helen received 2 years of supervised probation and was required to attend counseling for her role in enabling domestic violence. While I would have preferred to see her serve jail time, Maria explained that her sentence was actually quite harsh for someone in her position, particularly given her previously clean record. The judge wanted to send a message. Maria told me after sentencing, "Family members who encourage domestic violence can't hide behind claims of family loyalty. They're accessories to serious crimes, and they'll be held accountable." The legal victory felt satisfying, but it was only the beginning of my real recovery process. The physical healing happened relatively quickly. My arm set properly, my ribs healed without complications, and the cuts and bruises faded to faint scars within a few months. The emotional healing took much longer and required much more intentional work. Dr. Sarah Anderson, the therapist. I began seeing 2 weeks after the trial ended, specialized in trauma recovery for domestic violence survivors. Her office was in a quiet building near the university with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that made it feel more like someone's living room than a clinical space. Recovery from domestic violence isn't just about healing from individual incidents of abuse, Dr. Anderson explained during our first session. It's about rebuilding your entire sense of self, learning to trust your own judgment again, and developing healthy relationships with other people. She helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just physical violence, but a systematic campaign designed to destroy my independence, my confidence, and my connection to anyone who might help me escape. Marcus and Helen had used techniques that were common among domestic abusers: isolation, financial control, gaslighting, and escalating physical violence. They were very skilled at what they did, Dr. Anderson said matter-of-factly. This wasn't random violence or loss of control. This was calculated psychological warfare designed to make you completely dependent on them. Understanding the intentional nature of their abuse helped me stop blaming myself for not leaving sooner or fighting back more effectively. I'd been targeted by experts who had refined their methods over years of practice. The fact that I'd survived and eventually escaped wasn't a sign of my weakness. It was proof of my strength. The therapy sessions were sometimes more difficult than the physical recovery had been. Talking about the abuse meant reliving it emotionally, remembering the fear and helplessness and despair that had dominated my life for so long. But Dr. Anderson guided me through these difficult memories with patience and skill, helping me process the trauma without being overwhelmed by it. Sarah remained in Portland for 3 months, taking extended leave from her job to help me through the most difficult part of recovery. She attended some of my therapy sessions, helped me find a new apartment in a safe neighborhood, and provided the emotional support I needed to rebuild my confidence in daily activities. Finding a new place to live was more complicated than I'd expected. The house where Marcus and I had lived held too many traumatic memories for me to ever feel safe there again. But I also needed somewhere that felt secure, somewhere that Helen couldn't easily find if she decided to violate her probation by contacting me. Sarah helped me research different neighborhoods and security options. We eventually found a 1-bedroom apartment in a building with controlled access security cameras and neighbors who looked out for each other. The rent was higher than I could afford long-term on my own, but Sarah offered to help with expenses until I could get back on my feet financially. Returning to work presented its own challenges. My former employer at the advertising agency had held my position open during the legal proceedings, understanding that I'd been unable to work due to domestic violence rather than personal choice. But walking back into that office for the first time felt overwhelming. My coworkers were supportive but uncertain how to act around me. Some treated me with exaggerated gentleness, as if I might break at any moment. Others seemed to avoid me altogether, perhaps uncomfortable with the reality of domestic violence or unsure what to say. A few asked intrusive questions about my experiences, seemingly more interested in gossip than genuine concern for my well-being. My supervisor, Janet, handled the situation with perfect professionalism. She welcomed me back without fanfare, gave me projects that would allow me to rebuild my confidence gradually, and made it clear that I could ask for accommodations if I needed them. When other employees asked her about my situation, she redirected them firmly but politely. Whitney's personal life is her own business, I heard her tell one particularly nosy colleague. What matters here is that she's back, she's safe, and she's ready to do good work. That should be enough for everyone. The financial recovery took almost a year. Marcus had controlled all of our joint accounts, and the legal process of separating our finances was complicated by his incarceration. I had to rebuild my credit, establish new bank accounts, and learn to manage money independently after months of having no access to financial resources. Sarah connected me with a financial counselor who specialized in helping domestic violence survivors regain economic independence. Together, we created a budget that allowed me to pay my rent, cover my therapy costs, and gradually build an emergency fund that would give me security if I ever needed to leave a dangerous situation quickly. 18 months after the trial, I felt stable enough to consider volunteering with organizations that helped other domestic violence survivors. The women's shelter where I'd attended support groups asked if I'd be interested in sharing my story with newly arrived residents, women who were just beginning their own escape from abusive relationships. The first time I stood in front of a room full of women with fresh bruises and frightened eyes, I felt nervous and inadequate. What could I possibly say that would help them? How could I convince them that recovery was possible when they were still in the depths of their own trauma? But as I began to tell my story, I saw recognition in their faces. They understood the isolation, the self-doubt, the gradual erosion of their sense of reality. When I described Helen's role in encouraging Marcus's violence, several women nodded knowingly, having experienced similar betrayals from people they'd expected to protect them. The hardest part for me wasn't the physical abuse, I told them. It was learning that people I trusted, people who claimed to love me, were actually working together to destroy me. But surviving that experience taught me something important. I'm stronger than I ever thought possible, and so are all of you. After my presentation, Lisa, a 35-year-old woman with a black eye and a broken wrist, approached me privately. Her story was remarkably similar to mine, except that her husband's mother had been even more actively involved in planning and executing the abuse. She tells him where to hit me so the bruises won't show at work, Lisa whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make it more real. She gives him advice about how to control my money and who I'm allowed to talk to. Sometimes I think she hates me more than he does. I spent 2 hours talking with Lisa that night, sharing strategies for safety planning and connecting her with legal resources. 6 months later, she called to tell me that she'd left her husband and that his mother had been arrested for her role in the abuse. Hearing the strength and hope in Lisa's voice reminded me why sharing my story mattered. 2 years after the trial, I made the decision to move to a different city. Portland held too many painful memories, and I wanted to start fresh somewhere that Marcus and Helen had no connection to if they ever tried to find me after his release from prison. Sarah had moved back to Seattle and suggested that I consider relocating there as well. Seattle offered new opportunities both personally and professionally. I found a job with a larger advertising firm, one that specialized in campaigns for nonprofit organizations. Working on projects that promoted social justice and community health felt meaningful in a way that my previous work never had. I also met David, a high school English teacher who volunteered at the same community center, where I taught financial literacy classes for domestic violence survivors. David was patient, kind, and respectful of my boundaries in ways that reminded me what healthy relationships were supposed to look like. Our friendship developed slowly over 6 months before either of us considered it might become something romantic. When David finally asked if I'd be interested in having dinner with him outside of our volunteer work, I realized that I was ready to consider the possibility of trusting someone with my heart again. I need you to understand that I'm a domestic violence survivor, I told him during our first real date. That experience changed me in ways that will probably affect any relationship I have in the future. David listened carefully as I explained my history, my ongoing therapy, and my commitment to maintaining the independence and self-respect I'd worked so hard to rebuild. When I finished, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "Thank you for trusting me with something so personal," he said. "I can't promise that I'll always understand what you're going through, but I promise that I'll listen when you need to talk about it, and I'll respect whatever boundaries you need to feel safe." 3 years after the night I nearly died on my bedroom floor, I was living in a new city, working at a job I loved, volunteering to help other survivors, and slowly building a relationship with a man who treated me with the respect and kindness I deserved. The woman who had cowered in fear while Helen urged Marcus to hit her harder felt like someone from another lifetime. But I hadn't forgotten her, and I hadn't forgotten the lessons her suffering had taught me. I'd learned that family doesn't always mean safety, that love should never require you to accept abuse, and that women have the right to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Most importantly, I'd learned that surviving trauma doesn't make you broken. It makes you strong enough to help others survive their own battles. If you're watching this video because you recognize something in my story, please know that you deserve better than what you're experiencing now. You deserve to be safe, to be respected, and to live without fear. There are people who will help you escape, resources available to support your recovery, and a future waiting for you that doesn't include abuse. The scars on my arm have faded to thin white lines barely visible unless you know where to look. The emotional scars took longer to heal, but they've become sources of strength rather than shame. Every day, I choose to trust someone new. Every boundary I set and maintain, every time I help another survivor find her voice, I'm proving that Marcus and Helen didn't succeed in destroying me. They tried to break my spirit, but instead they taught me how resilient that spirit actually was. Sometimes the deepest wounds teach us the most important lessons about our own capacity for healing and growth. I wouldn't wish my experiences on anyone, but I'm grateful for the woman those experiences helped me become. What did you learn from Whitney's story about recognizing the warning signs of domestic violence? Have you or someone you know experienced similar situations with family members enabling abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about supporting survivors and preventing domestic violence. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of survival and resilience. Your engagement helps these important stories reach people who need to hear them. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from Whitney's message of hope and recovery. Thank you for listening to this difficult but important story, and remember that speaking truth about abuse is the first step toward ending it. Stay strong, stay safe, and know that you're never alone in your journey toward healing.